Okay, welcome everyone to our the second of three panels that we are hosting today as part of the Worldwide Teach-In on Climate and Justice. I'm Claire Jantz. I'm a professor in the Geography Earth Science Department and also the director of Shippensburg University Center for Land Use and Sustainability. Fostering sustainability, equity, and justice is one of the core values of the CLUS, and so we're really excited to convene these three panels today. We are just one of many worldwide teach-ins that are happening today, and this is really, this teach-in, the purpose is to really try to focus in on social equity and justice issues related to climate and climate change impacts. If you are joining via Zoom, you will be able to submit questions through the Q&A. And we're also excited to hear where you're joining from. So if you want to share your location in the chat, just so we have an idea of geographically where everybody is joining from over Zoom, that would be great. And just to kind of refocus us on the climate issue, in just this past February, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a new installment in their 6th assessment report. And in that report, they noted that existing vulnerabilities and inequalities intensify with adverse impacts of climate change. They also said that those with climate sensitive and precarious livelihood conditions are often least able to adapt. They're afforded limited adaptation opportunities, and they have little influence on decision makings. And those findings, which are sort of found at the global level, really emphasize the need to place social justice at the center of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation strategies. The focus of our worldwide teach-in on climate change here at Shippensburg is to expose existing social inequalities and to learn how our communities can address these inequalities. Because just working towards a more equitable society and a more just society will result in communities that are more resilient to climate change. We know that low-income communities of color are much more likely to be experiencing the effects of climate change, from heat waves to flood hazards to poor air quality and others. But it's important to know that those communities are not powerless, nor are they alone in their work to achieve a more just and equitable society. So on that note, we are really pleased to have a team from the New Mexico Environmental Law Center joining us today. I'll introduce them shortly, but a little bit about the Law Center. They have been, since 1987, the Law Center has been defending environmental justice, working with New Mexico's communities to protect the air, land, and water. And this is an award-winning center. Just recently, the director of the Law Center, Virginia Necochea, was awarded the Catalyst Award by the national nonprofit Rachel's Network. This award honors women leaders of color for their commitment to a healthy planet. And one of our panelists, Eric Jantz, in 2019 was named New Mexico's Environmental Lawyer of the Year. And for full disclosure, Eric is my brother. And so that makes this even better for him to be joining us, for him and his team to be joining us. So on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Eric. Eric is a senior staff attorney at the New Mexico Environmental Law Center, and he is joined by staff attorneys Maslyn Locke and Mia Montoya Hammersley. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Jantz. Like Dr. Jantz said, I am her older brother, so I just call her Claire. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be invited. I appreciate Claire's invitation, as well as the invitation from the University of Shippensburg. I am senior staff attorney at the New Mexico Environmental Law Center. I've been with the center since 2001. As Claire said, we were founded in 1987. Our initial years were spent doing sort of conventional environmental law, Endangered Species Act work, wilderness, public lands work. But then about 5 years in, we had sort of a watershed moment where we began to really start doing environmental justice work, working specifically with low-income communities and communities of color to vindicate their environmental rights. And we're one of the few organizations, legal organizations in the country that focuses specifically on environmental justice issues. And we're the only nonprofit legal organization in New Mexico that does this sort of work. So needless to say, we have our hands full. We litigate and work on policy issues in a wide range of areas, everything from land use to mining to oil and gas to greenhouse gases to industrial air pollution in urban areas. My particular practice areas have focused mainly over the last 20 years on working on uranium issues in the northwestern part of the state, largely in indigenous communities, particularly on Navajo. I also do quite a bit of work on the concentration of industrial air pollution in the state's urban areas, most particularly in Albuquerque, where I live. So with that, I'll pass it on to Maslyn and ask her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for having us. So like Eric said, my name is Maslyn Locke. I'm a staff attorney at the Law Center. I've been with the Law Center since August of 2020. Prior to that, I was a staff attorney at New Mexico Legal Aid, working with community members on a lot of different sort of socioeconomic related issues. And now I primarily focus on air quality work and water quantity work, particularly in Albuquerque and in the South Valley and in the northern parts of New Mexico. And most of my air quality work has been around hot mix asphalt batch plants. So if anyone has any questions about that or wants to try to say it 3 times fast, feel free. It's an area I never thought I'd be into, but now here we are. So yeah, I'm excited to talk to you all today, and I will pass it to Mia.
I say I once made the mistake of asking Maslyn about asphalt. I think it was a several hours long conversation. So hi everybody, I'm on the Tabote. Bienvenue, greetings to my relatives. My name is Mia Montoya Hammersley, and I am also a staff attorney here at the Law Center. I'm also a member of the Piro Mansotiwa tribe here in New Mexico. Our ancestral lands are throughout central and southern New Mexico and kind of across the state boundaries in that geographic area. And I'm also a Yaqui descendant. My primary practice areas now are also some water quality and quantity issues, Indigenous peoples, lawn policy issues, land and zoning issues, and then increasingly uranium and Superfund cleanup.
So with that, I think we'll kick it off. And I guess we have a series of questions. Yeah, Claire?
Sorry, I moved from my station. We had a number of folks chiming in from the chat to tell us where they are from. And we have Occupied Tiwa Land, aka Albuquerque, Flagstaff, Arizona, Tiwa Land, Nola, Pennsylvania, Upper Stroudsburg, Rogers Park. So we have people so far signed in from a number of places on Zoom, but no questions as of yet. So Eric, you should just share your screen and take it away.
Okay, well, we have some series of we have a series of questions, and this is our website if you'd like to learn more about the work that we do and the Law Center itself. But we'll start off by discussing what is environmental justice. So Maslyn, what do we got?
So much, Eric. Thank you. I wanted to start, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Eric. But I wanted to start with a definition of environmental justice to make sure we're all sort of coming at this from the same working definition. And in order to really have a sense of what environmental justice work is, or justice work is in general, the first point I wanted to make is really this important distinction between equity and equality. I'm guessing a lot of you have seen this graphic. On the one side, you have equality, right, which is this idea that everyone gets the same sort of level of assistance regardless of their starting point, right? But you can see that there really can't be a one size fits all, literally in this image, a one size fits all solution. So the other side of the image attempts to conceptualize the idea of equity, right? Understanding that people are coming from different starting points, so solutions to different challenges should be tailored accordingly. And I wanted to note that there's kind of one issue with this graphic, which is that this sort of adversity, right, that the graphic depicts, this fence and the whole system being equal, the problem is really inherent to the individuals, right, in terms of their height. It really implies that the adversity or the problem or the challenge is inherent to the person. So I like this image a little bit more because it shows that really the challenges that community groups are facing, right, is systemic. It is not inherent to an individual. It is more a product of the overarching structure of society. So you can see that the fence here is not the same for everyone. The ground level is not the same for everyone. All three figures are more of the same height. And it's this depiction that shows that the system is designed to impact different people disproportionately, and really helps demonstrate that equity is the goal, not so much equality. So it's with this in mind that sort of different entities and scholars and folks smarter than me have attempted to define environmental justice. There's a lot of different definitions, sort of depending on the framework with which someone is engaging with environmental justice. Probably the definition that most folks are familiar with and run into the most is the definition that comes from the EPA or different state agencies, which is that environmental justice is defined as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies, right? And I would say that this definition is fine, but it leaves out some important points and ideas, particularly the idea of recognitional justice, which I'll talk about in a second. But another good definition that I think I prefer, comes from Dr. Robert Bullard, who is currently a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy and the director of the Bullard Center for Environmental Justice and Climate Justice. And his definition of environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities have a right to equal protection and equal enforcement of environmental laws and regulations, and that all people are entitled to equitable environmental protection regardless of race, color, national origin, and have the right to live, work, and play in a clean environment. So as I said, there are a lot of different definitions. Those are two kind of big ones, and I'll let Eric and Mia add to this in a second. But the other point I wanted to make about how environmental justice is defined is that it really should include sort of three different types of justice. So there's this idea of distributive justice, which is probably the most common understanding of environmental justice, meaning sort of the appropriate division of social advantages or disadvantages, sort of an equitable risk of harm or an equal risk of harm to all people, and an equal distribution of impacts of environmental pollution. And we've talked about why equal isn't necessarily the right metric, right? There's this notion of procedural justice, which focuses more on the process. So a lot of the work that we do at the Law Center also includes procedural access to things like the permitting process and making sure that folks have access to documents in the language that they speak and access to participate in the whole permitting process. And then there's this idea of recognitional justice, which is, I think, the most important. It's the most absent from most environmental justice definitions, but it's this recognition of group difference, right? Ultimately acknowledging that there's an institutionalization of unconscious biases and exclusionary processes and judgments that influence social structures, which ultimately manifest in racially disparate outcomes. And that's the part when you're defining environmental justice that is, I think, the most important. It's kind of what this last image is attempting to show. But the idea being that different groups face environmental challenges in different ways, and the system is not functioning the same for everyone, such that environmental impacts impact people differently. So that is a lot of words about how I define environmental justice. And Eric and Mia, if you all want to add to that, please feel free. But, yeah.
I'll hop in, Eric, before you hear. I think, yeah, I agree with everything Maslyn said. I think it's a complex thing to define, and I think I would just add that environmental justice is inherently intersectional. There's some good resources from, I think they're just called the Intersectional Environmentalist, if you want to look at that as a resource. But environmental justice, intersects various identities and various social movements also. So it has elements of, civil rights, economic justice, social justice, and all of those things are at play when we're talking about how do we achieve, environmental justice for a given community.
And just one last thought. The intersectionality in terms of social, economic justice is really important. I think that in terms of environmental justice work, one of the things that we're really challenging and really confronting on a daily basis is sort of one of the pillars of our economic system, right? And that's externalities, externalizing the costs of pollution. And so when we work with communities like Navajo in Albuquerque and South Santa Fe, what we're really challenging is not only the health impacts on those communities from the polluting industries that they live beside, but also this idea that those externalities are never accounted for, right? So I think that's a really critical point, and one that's often really not considered when talking about environmental justice, at least in sort of the general way. So I think the next thing that we'd like to talk about is what environmental justice looks like in practice. And you want to kick it off, Maslyn?
Yeah, so, and we can't, talk about environmental justice, I think, without naming environmental racism, right? Which is really, it can be the deliberate targeting of communities of color for the siting of toxic facilities. It can show up as individuals and families are not able to relocate to escape environmental hazards because of racism, housing discrimination, residential segregation, all of those things. And it's ultimately this relationship, right, between racial identity and the siting of hazards. Race and class play a significant role in environmental decision-making. Race is still the strongest predictor of proximity, someone's proximity to living near a toxic source. Zip code is still the strongest predictor of an individual's health and well-being. And it's ultimately this fact that communities of color, we know this, and low-income communities are disproportionately affected by siting decisions and permitting of facilities, right? So I would say in our work, there appears to be sort of governmental support for policies that continue to disproportionately place polluting industries in minority and low-income communities to stimulate development, like you were saying, Eric, at the cost of human lives. And in practice, I would say I included this picture because I wanted to sort of show, I think, what a lot of people think of when they think of environmental justice. You have this coal plant. This is a Duke Energy power plant behind a playground, right? And a lot of times what industrial operations will do is they will come into communities that are often already dealing with things like food insecurity and housing insecurity. And they will sort of try to distract from the poison by doing things like providing a playground or a park or things for local community members to come and enjoy the air pollution around them, right? And really what they're doing is really trying to incentivize, I think, this sort of system, this structure, this environmental racism to try to encourage community to not push back against what's happening. And then I would say the only other thing I would say is that in New Mexico, most recently, I've seen environmental justice, environmental racism play out most recently in the siting of this asphalt plant on Santa Fe's south side. So the south side of Santa Fe, and I don't know what y'all know about Santa Fe, New Mexico, but it has a lot of more affluent, whiter folks that live on one part of town and a lot of lower income, young families who primarily speak Spanish on the south side of town. And all of the industrial operations are sited pretty much on the south side of town. So we've been working with those community groups to challenge permitting and the decision-making around that community because it is disproportionately impacting those community groups, right? So Mia.
What it looks like in practice. I think one good example, so until recently, we had two, really high polluting coal-fired power plants in the region. One was the San Juan Generating Station and the other over in Arizona. Across the border was the Navajo Generating Station, both on, Navajo Nation lands. And for, decades, those coal-fired power plants created a high amount of toxic pollution, regionally, honestly, but especially for the local communities, the local Indigenous communities around there. The coal-fired power plants provided electricity that enabled the growth of a lot of the surrounding urban areas in the Southwest, including, Phoenix, Albuquerque, Las Vegas. I think even some power was exported to California. So at the same time that this resource is being used on Indigenous lands, the Navajo Nation, many of its residents still do not have electricity. So while, all of the environmental burdens are being shouldered by Indigenous communities, all of the environmental benefits are being, exported to, non-tribal communities. And that would be another example of how environmental racism has played out in some of our communities here in New Mexico. Eric?
Thank you. So in practice, there are many different ways that environmental racism manifests itself. Mia and Maslyn have talked some of their experience. I want to show you this map of Albuquerque. Albuquerque lies in the center of New Mexico. It's New Mexico's largest city and its commercial hub. And as such, it has more industry than any other city in the state. And this is a map of the air pollution permits that the regulatory agency responsible for Albuquerque and Bernalillo County, where Albuquerque resides, have issued. And you can see that there are a few areas of concentration, although you'll notice that most of the concentration lies right along this axis here, along the interstate, there are railroad tracks that parallel this. And these are largely low-income communities and communities of color. In particular, you have a lot of pollution permits issued in two South Valley communities, San Jose and Mountain View. And not coincidentally, these communities also have the highest incidence of hospitalizations for children for asthma, a much higher incidence of cancers associated with air pollution, and a much higher incidence of heart disease and pulmonary disease. Back in 2011, there was a health impact assessment done, which compared the life expectancies for more vulnerable areas, those lower income communities who have less access to healthcare, less access to other resources, housing, employment, and the wealthier communities, which are generally located up around the northern and northeastern parts of Albuquerque. And comparing the most disadvantaged census tract to the most advantaged census tract, there was a discrepancy in life expectancy of 25 years. So your zip code really does determine your quality of life, your health, and in fact, how long you're going to live. In practice, environmental racism also looks like this. I'm sorry about the quality for this slide. This is a photograph of the site of a proposed uranium mine in Church Rock, New Mexico, in the northwestern part of the state. Church Rock is a Navajo Diné community. And you can see all these other abandoned uranium mines around the proposed mine site. When this proposed mine was getting licensed by the United States government, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the commission essentially erased the history of this area and all the mines around here. An administrative law judge came out to the community to do a site visit, and as in his later written decision, he said something to the effect of, "I've seen the vastness of the desert, and I can't imagine how this proposed mine could have any impact on the health or well-being of the community." So with that several sentence quote, he essentially erased decades of history of uranium mining and the waste that still exists in these communities. And so that's, in my experience, a lot of what environmental racism looks like in practice. So I want to address the next question, which is, why does environmental justice matter? And I think that Mia and Mazlin will surely have some thoughts on that. But I want to start with a client and a friend of mine, Edith. Edith is a Navajo woman. She lives in a community called Redwater Pond Road. It's a small Navajo village that's been in its location for generations. And Edith has lived there her whole life. The community is exclusively Diné, Navajo, and it's situated beside 3 uranium Superfund sites, 2 mines, and an old uranium mill. Edith is a cancer survivor. She had lymphoma, and she had no other risk factors for cancer other than living beside 3 radioactive waste dumps. So this is sort of illustrative of my first thought about why environmental justice matters. And that's because it's a moral issue. Edith's life and Edith's health shouldn't be worth less than anybody else's. But because of the structures that perpetuated and promoted uranium mining and externalized the costs, the waste, the result is that Edith really has had a much more difficult time than similarly situated white communities. It also matters in terms of law. So, although it's increasingly becoming, because of our federal Supreme Court, that disparate impacts don't really matter, current law still requires that federal government and anybody who gets, any state agency that gets federal money, conduct its business, whether it's permitting a polluting operation, whether it's enforcing the laws, or whether it's cleaning up pollution, that it conduct that in a way that doesn't discriminate against people because of their race, ethnicity, or national origin. And even though that's still the law in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VI, governments still do it. And that's largely in part because that law is very poorly enforced. In addition to federal law, there are many state laws that require equal treatment. There's a constitution, state constitutions. Almost all of them have equal protection clauses, which require that everybody be treated equally under the law, regardless of race or ethnicity or national origin. And then there's international law. Most international human rights instruments require a certain degree of equity. Some more than others. One in particular, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, speaks specifically to the issue that ethnic and racial minorities within sovereign states aren't to be discriminated against. So there are legal reasons why environmental law or environmental justice matters. And then there are also practical reasons. Inequities in terms of environmental pollution and in terms of economics lead to less prosperous and less stable societies. So even if you're going to put aside the moral implications and the legal implications, if you're just looking at the economics, it doesn't make any sense to marginalize some communities based on race, ethnicity, or national origin, because it brings down the economic productivity of the entire society. So those are the reasons, in my view, why environmental justice matters. Mia, do you want to add some thoughts?
A lot of thoughts about why it matters, but I'm also kind of looking at the time and seeing that we're less than halfway through our questions. Maybe I can roll some of my thoughts into our discussion of the next question, which is, how does climate injustice and environmental, what does climate justice look like in practice? And how does environmental justice relate to climate justice? So I think, thank you, Eric. Like environmental justice, climate justice is an intersectional movement that seeks to address the inequalities inherent to how we address the climate crisis. It seeks to address environmental racism in our efforts to combat the climate crisis. So it's in a way, part of the environmental justice movement, perhaps in some ways like the future of the environmental justice movement. As looking forward, we just saw the results of the latest IPCC report, and we're all watching world leaders kind of lacking the responses necessary to combat climate change, and of course environmental racism continue to be pervasive and to have disproportionate impacts on low-income communities and communities of color as climate change continues to intensify. So, communities that are seeking to address climate justice are striving to have inequalities addressed so that we can have an equitable transition to a post-fossil free dependent world without, once again, the costs of this transition being disproportionately borne by communities of color and low-income communities, while all of the benefits of this transition, continuing to be held by communities with more privilege. So I think we also wanted to talk about what climate justice looks like in practice. Maslyn?
Oh man, I think it looks like a lot of things, but right, it's again this understanding, like you're saying, Mia, that climate inequities are different depending on social and economic and public health status, which means that mitigation and adaptation needs to look different as well. There's no one size fits all climate justice solution either. It might look like a culturally appropriate relocation in one area that's been impacted by uranium mining. And what I sort of always try to remember when I think about what climate justice looks like is really this idea that different groups want it to look like different things. So a lot of world leaders are talking a lot about carbon offsets, carbon markets, which is sort of this idea that a lot of things can sort of carry on as business as usual, right? But the impacts can be offset by, I think the most commonly heard one is like planting 12 trees, or if you buy a plane ticket, that airline company is going to plant trees to offset the impacts of your plane ticket, right? But in a lot of circumstances, especially in the work that we do in the communities that we're working with, those ideas are not considered justice. They're not climate justice, because a lot of these systems continue to disproportionately negatively impact frontline communities, and the benefits and the burdens are still not equitably distributed. So yeah, that's kind of how I think about climate justice in practice. But Mia and Eric, what do you want to add to that?
And I think along those lines, it's really important to scrutinize purported climate solutions, right? When they're being offered, looking at who's offering them, who they're offered to, and in what spirit they're being offered. Because oftentimes a lot of these so-called climate solutions aren't really solutions at all. I mean, Maslyn talked about cap and trade and carbon offsets and how they don't really reflect an equitable solution. Another false solution is the idea that nuclear power is going to be a critical element in the climate, in the transition to a fossil-free future. The corporate line is that nuclear is a emissions-free source of electricity. That's not true. But even notwithstanding the fact that it's not carbon free, the conversations never talk about sort of the full impacts of every step of the nuclear fuel chain. In particular, we in New Mexico are concerned with the front end, the uranium mining and processing part. But I think that sort of feeds into the next part of our discussion, which is nuclear colonialism and what that looks like. So Mia.
Great. So before I talk about nuclear colonialism, I'll back up a little bit and just give you all a bit of a background on, Indigenous peoples' law and Indigenous climate justice and how this ties into nuclear colonialism. So Indigenous people are, sovereign communities whose existence has been tied to their ancestral territories since time immemorial. So all of our, our cultures, our oral histories, our diets and our ceremonies are all tied into the lands and our ancestral lands. So because of that, climate change and other environmental health hazards impact us a little bit differently than other frontline communities. Really briefly, I don't know how many of you have heard of the doctrine of discovery before, but the doctrine of discovery is, a doctrine that dates back to kind of the crusading era, first created by papal decrees that sought to basically justify European colonizers' claims on foreign lands and to justify the atrocities that were often inflicted on, non-Christian people, and to promote, Eurocentric and Christian domination during, the time that the world was being explored. So it's essentially the idea that at that time, non-Christian societies outside of Europe were less than human and therefore ineligible to be assimilated into Christian society, into civilized society, therefore justifying the taking of their lands and the forced slavery of their people. This history played out differently in different parts of the world and in different communities, but it is kind of the founding principle for the government to government interactions between tribes, federally recognized tribes in the United States and the federal government. If you look to a lot of the founding Supreme Court cases on federal Indian law, many of those decisions are based on the doctrine of discovery, and you will continue to see those cases cited in every single Supreme Court case addressing, Indigenous peoples' law to this day. So even though this is a doctrine that was, kind of founded and practiced, historically in the past, it's still something that persists to this day and impacts Indigenous communities to this day. So on that note, I think to talk about nuclear colonialism, there are really two main types of colonialism, and nuclear colonialism includes aspects of both of them. There's extractive colonialism, which is when a colonizing nation goes into a land specifically to extract resources without the intention to actually settle or enlarge their society or move their society to that land. You could see that, for example, in a place like India. That was an extractive colonial relationship. The second type is settler colonialism, and that, to the contrary, is where a colonizing nation actually intends to go and take over the land and populate the land with their own people. So nuclear colonialism, again, like environmental justice, there's a couple different ways to define this term. It was really first coined by the Indigenous environmentalist Winona LaDuke, but I define it as a system of domination through which governments and corporations disproportionately target and devastate Indigenous peoples and their lands in order to maintain the nuclear production process. So here in New Mexico, we experience the full life cycle of the nuclear weapons development process, everything from uranium mining to nuclear testing, and then at the end of the life cycle, storage of nuclear waste here. So I come from a community, my family is from Tularosa, New Mexico. Many people don't know that the world's first nuclear weapon was actually detonated here in New Mexico in the Tularosa Basin in 1945. This is the picture you can see here on the slide. This nuclear test was carried out in the White Sands, which is now a national park, but the White Sands is also an area that's incredibly sacred to many Indigenous communities. And of course, the narrative was that this test was done because there are no people in this area. And like Eric said about the administrative law judge who came out to northern New Mexico and just kind of sees a vast desert. Similarly here, there were, hundreds of thousands of people within 150 miles of the blast zone, and the effects of that nuclear radiation continues to this day. So that's just one aspect of how nuclear colonialism plays out here in New Mexico. And I will turn it over to Eric and Maslyn to discuss some more examples of what nuclear colonialism looks like here.
So like Mia said, we in New Mexico have the misfortune of being basically a nuclear colony. It started with weapons production, but continues for production for the feedstock for nuclear power plants. So this is a graphic of the nuclear fuel chain. And we experience a lot of the first part, some of the second part here, conversion and enrichment. We don't have we don't have any nuclear power plants in New Mexico. What this graphic is missing is the storage of nuclear waste. We are have a target in the southeastern part of the state for storage of temporary, quote unquote, storage of high level nuclear waste. So we're kind of New Mexico is kind of the Walmart of the nuclear industry, in that we're sort of the one-stop shopping. We've got it all. And as you can see, with each step of the nuclear fuel chain, there is waste. The waste that we deal mostly with is the waste from uranium mining and milling. This is a map of northwestern New Mexico, and it shows all of the uranium mining and exploration projects from the 1950s to the 1980s. There have been a few more since then, but since the uranium market tanked in the mid-80s, there haven't been that many. It's important to recognize that you can see this cluster around Mount Taylor. It's important to recognize that Mount Taylor is an incredibly important cultural site for many of the tribes and pueblos in New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado as well. This is a picture of the last producing uranium mine in New Mexico, the Mount Taylor mine. It began decommissioning in 2019 because of community pressure, but it is still, there's still plenty of waste associated with this mine. And again, as the name would suggest, it's on the western flanks of Mount Taylor. So this is well within what have been identified as traditional cultural properties for the Pueblo of Acoma, for the Pueblo of Laguna. And it's also within the traditional homeland of the Navajo people. It's the Turquoise Mountain Tzotzil, which is the one of the markers of the traditional area between the four sacred mountains of the Navajo. So this is one of those sacred mountains. This is a picture of the Homestake Mill, not far from the Mount Taylor mine. This is located approximately 250 feet from the nearest neighborhood. It's largely a it's entirely a low-income neighborhood, but it's largely Latinx. And this right here is mill tailings waste. So this is hundreds of millions of tons of radioactive waste piled on the landscape. It's leaching into groundwater. It's blowing across people's homes and yards and fields. And as I said, it's also on the western flank of Mount Taylor. You remember Edith, our client, my friend. This is a map of the community where she lives. It's this area right here. And as you can see, there are 3 uranium-related Superfund sites where in their immediate neighborhood. So this is the old nuclear United Nuclear Corp Northeast Churchwright mine, the Kermit Cavera mine, and the United Nuclear Corp uranium mill, old mill. And many people don't realize this, but this UNC mill is the site of the largest nuclear accident in U.S. history. In 1979, July, tailings dam, which held the waste from processing radioactive and toxic liquid waste and sludge. It was an earthen dam that burst. It released 93 million gallons of radioactive and toxic sludge down the Puerco River, and it has never been cleaned up. It's worth noting again that those are the communities that have been impacted are almost exclusively Navajo. This is a picture of the Redwater Pine Road community. This is Edith's house, and this is a pile of mine waste. This is radioactive. It is also filled with heavy metals. Until 2005, the mine actually shut down in the 70s, but until 2005, the United States government had required that the operator, which is now GE, who, as we probably all realize, has plenty of resources at its disposal. The federal government didn't require any cleanup of this at all. In 2005, finally, the EPA began requiring remediation. That remediation is ongoing, but I will say that those waste piles are still there. So that's all I have. Mia and Mazlin, do you want to add any additional thoughts?
I guess I'll just add that I know, there's been an increase in dialogue around nuclear energy as a solution to the climate crisis, and especially as we're seeing the conflict in Ukraine play out, a lot more dialogue around production of nuclear weapons also. And I think, we just want to emphasize that nuclear power as a solution to the crime is not a solution to the climate crisis, and actually carries a really, really heavy burden for communities that are already, often already overburdened by uranium mining or other environmental health hazards, and that these environmental health hazards tend to combine with other climate-related impacts. So in the end, it really creates a situation where there are sacrifice zones, right, where communities have to bear the burden of nuclear production, nuclear mining to benefit others, while they are dealing every day with these health impacts from like Eric was discussing. So I think it's important as folks who are practicing in New Mexico to kind of disrupt that narrative of nuclear power as a solution to the climate crisis.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add really is every time we look at these pictures, right, to me it's incredibly startling. Like, that looks just like a normal hill, right next to Edith's house, and it is not a normal hill. And all of these sort of solutions, right, nuclear energy solutions, have very real awful impacts on the lives of the people living closest to it, right? So I think with that, we didn't want to leave you just with that big downer, and we thought we might try to offer some advice or our thoughts about how to address environmental injustices, given the time. So I'll give it back to you, Eric, unless you had more to add.
No, I think it is important to kind of talk about solutions rather than just the problems. And so, in my view, I think that a few things can be done. I mean, obviously, the Law Center is working with communities to address these problems. And so organizing and activating are certainly the biggest sort of things that can be done, in my opinion, right? Mass movement for climate justice is going to be, I think, necessary to really confront what the world is faced with right now. The other thing is sort of, I guess, more personal and on a more individual level, but I think for white folks, white men in particular, introspection is not a bad thing. I think that it's important that we evaluate and look at the privileges that we've inherited and that we have in this society, and start to really question those and think about ways that we can extend the kind of privileges that we've looked at, that we have many times, that we don't even realize we have without some serious looking in the mirror, and figure out the best ways for us to extend those privileges to those who haven't had them. So I think that those are kind of my two cents on sort of solutions to these issues. And this is the organizing part. Every year, the community of Church Rock, and it's done it for the last 15 years, has a commemoration of the 1979 Church Rock spill, demanding cleanup and justice for those communities and all the communities that were impacted by that incident.
Yeah, and I'll just add to what you're saying, Eric. I think the most important thing you all can do is really understand that the community knows best. The community will speak for itself, themselves. And the way, especially as lawyers, how we lawyer, the model is that we're there as a tool and as a resource, but never there with community to make decisions on their behalf, right? And then I'll just say sort of my own sort of 2 cents or advice, if you're going to be involved in this work, is to sort of redefine what success might mean to you, because this work is really hard and it takes decades of work. Eric can speak at a later time about his case that took 10 years just to like move this much probably, but it's really hard and really challenging and can be a real downer, for lack of a better word. So making sure that you find the good in it and the way that you can move forward in a way that carries you forward, I think is important. But Mia.
Yeah, I agree with that, Maslyn. I think, Indigenous communities all often talk about creating a better world for the next 7 generations. And that is just recognizing that the work that we do in our lifetimes, we may not see the result of that in our lifetimes. And we just have to trust that we are part of a larger movement, a larger purpose in life, and that even our actions, we're going to enable those who come after us to get a little bit farther in the work than we did. And I think greater society has so much to learn from Indigenous communities and frontline communities. Like Maslyn said, communities are always the experts of their own experiences. For Indigenous communities looking forward, into a future that's going to be much more impacted by climate change, I think I find a lot of comfort in knowing that, our communities have already lived through an apocalypse. The world as we know it has already changed drastically throughout our histories of, colonization and genocide, and we're still here and we're thriving. And I know a lot of the communities that we've talked about today are incredibly resilient. And that gives me hope that, all of us have the resilience to continue this work and to make things better for our descendants.
So thank you both. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to do this. And thank you, Claire and everybody, for your time.
Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. We do have a few questions in the or a few comments and questions. You all did get a shout out from Ashley, who said she's so glad she attended the seminar, as this is a field of work that she wants to go into, especially Indigenous justice. So she's definitely going to be checking out your firm. Lots of thank yous coming in. In terms of Q&A, we have, let's see, we have a question about the Cash for Clunkers program, which was, you might remember, a federal program to buy up inefficient cars, and whether or not that was an equitable program. Used cars are much cheaper for low-income populations, but as a result of this program, this used car market was largely reduced. What are your thoughts overall?
Well, I definitely have thoughts on that. And I know that Claire and my other siblings who are on this Zoom, it's almost like a mini family reunion, are going to hear me channeling our father. But I definitely think that the Cash for Clunkers is problematic. One, from a purely economic standpoint, it doesn't necessarily, the money you get for your clunker doesn't necessarily get you what you need for new transportation. But taking sort of a much broader view is that this country's transportation infrastructure as a whole is grossly inequitable. Right. And this idea of individualizing, externalizing essentially the costs of transportation is deeply problematic. So rather than, invest money for ditching old cars for new ones, that money would have been better spent investing in public transit infrastructure, walkable, bikeable communities, and decreasing urban sprawl. In other words, getting into the meat of land use policies. So all of that, I think, really was never considered. The assumption for Cash for Clunkers was cars are the best form of transportation. That's what we're sticking with. But really, for most low-income communities of color, they're poorly served by transportation infrastructure, in my experience.
Do we have any questions out in the audience? Any reactions? I'm seeing a lot of comments from folks in the chat about how much they learned. We have a comment: always appreciate your long dedication to oil and gas impacts on the front line. So you all have some fans here.
Yeah, and Don is a longtime ally of the Law Center and incredible advocate for his community. And one of the issues with our transportation infrastructure is it, fosters and continues the dependence on fossil fuels, right? And in New Mexico, we not only have to deal with the pollution from traffic, but in the northwestern part of the state, in the San Juan oil basin, in this northwestern part of the state, in the San Juan oil basin and oil and gas basin, in the southeastern part of the state, in the Permian oil and gas basin, those communities have to deal with the pollution from extraction, fracking, right? And so they not only have to deal with, at least in the San Juan Basin, the largest methane cloud in the world. It's visible from space. It's about the size of the state of Delaware. They also have to deal with their land being contaminated, and these are communities that have often made their living through agriculture, whether it be farming or ranching. So it not only destroys their land, but their livelihoods, as well as contaminating huge swaths of water, which in the Southwest is ill-advised.
So I have a couple of questions, if I may. We are, and this is kind of coming from the Shippensburg perspective, many of the points that you made really sort of hit pretty hard in terms of things like offsets. And I'll tell you why, because our university, as many universities have, signed off on a climate commitment to go carbon neutral. And many, and Google is carbon neutral, that's not unusual. And we're in the process of developing a plan to go carbon neutral. But we know that we cannot reduce all of our emissions to zero. Even if we purchase all of our electricity from solar panels, many of us are still, especially from commuting and travel related. And so the push, or, the way that we get to carbon neutrality is through offsets. And you have suddenly really problematized that issue of offsets. Let's just purchase offsets. How can we get to carbon neutrality without having these sacrifice zones?
I don't know which one of you wants to go first, or if you're all staring at me. I think Eric's staring at me. So first of all, Dr. Jantz, I'm sorry to cause this problem for you all. I think so. The issue, first of all, the issue really with offsets is that it's sort of what we're hearing from frontline communities is that it pushes the burden kind of away from the polluter themselves and allows them to continue sort of with business as usual, right? Instead of really addressing the fact that what we really need is systems change, right? We can't carry on with business as usual. We can't keep extracting fossil fuels at the cost of the lives of people, right? I will not pretend to have the answer for how to do this the right way or the best way, except to say that the communities impacted by what's going on now should be the ones leading this conversation. And what we're dealing with right now is that oftentimes they're not. So I'll let Mia and Eric add to that not answer that I just gave you, but yeah. Don't all jump in at once.
No, thank you, Maslyn. Yeah, this is a conversation we've been having a lot lately at the Law Center, because it's also a big issue here in New Mexico in this last legislative session for us. So I would say that, offsets are often used as a way to kind of become complacent again. Like, we've solved this problem. We can kind of just say we're carbon neutral and then just forget about it. I think understandably, like Maslyn said, there are a lot of industries where it could take, a long time to decarbonize fully. And it makes sense that we are searching for tools to use in that interim period. But I think that the danger is just not, using offsets and saying, oh, this is the solution. We can just walk away now and pat ourselves on the back and, we're carbon neutral. I think the challenge of offsets is to really look closely at what the actual impacts are and to not stop there, to continue to push for systems change that can provide, actual decarbonization.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mass.
Well, I was just going to add that even groups like the WEJAC, the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, and the NEJAC, I think is the other one, but they're even looking at offsets, right? Because there is the idea, the hope is that there's a way to do offsets in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact these already impacted communities. But go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with everything Mia and Matt said. I mean, it definitely is an ongoing conversation. And I think that one of the significant issues is that conversation really hasn't included fence line and frontline communities, right? And until it does, I don't think that offsets can be truly viewed as a meaningful solution. But that sort of process bit notwithstanding, I mean, I also think that the offset and emissions trading frameworks also present an opportunity to really scrutinize and challenge the economic system that we have, because every trade emissions trading scheme, offset scheme that I've seen involves continuing this system of endless consumption, centralized utility generation, electricity generation, and tends to be reinforce sort of the existing power structures, right? And until that's really questioned in a meaningful way, I'm not sure that it's workable. I hear a lot that, if you're discounting offsets, it's totally infeasible, it's impracticable. I don't agree with that. I think that they're conflating difficult with impractical. And there's no doubt that it'll be difficult, but I think it'll be less difficult challenging sort of the economic systems and, dealing with the dislocations that are going to come, economic and social dislocations that are going to come from transitioning off of fossil fuels. It's going to be a lot less hard than dealing with the apocalyptic hellscape that we'll end up living in if we don't.
Well, on that cheerful comment, we are about at time. Are there any other questions out in the audience or any other on Zoom? I would just like to really express my, yes. Oh, we have one. Mavis, can you?
Yes, I'm so sorry. I know, can you hear me?
If you ask it, I can repeat the question. Yeah, I think the batteries might be dead.
I think it's dead.
I'm so sorry. Just give it out and I'll repeat it so they can hear it.
Okay, so this is more of terms of international law, but I know that under the Declaration of the UN Charter of Human Rights, it's wouldn't installing like nuclear mines, uranium mines, and power plants on indigenous land be a violation of someone's social and cultural rights. So couldn't the Navajo Nation argue in international courts that what the United States was doing and is still doing is a violation of their human rights?
That is an excellent question, and this team is going to love it. So the question from the audience was related to the UN Charter of Human Rights and whether or not the activities that are occurring on Navajo land constitutes a violation of that charter in terms of infringement on social and cultural rights, and whether or not there is an avenue in international courts to try to address that issue.
Well, it's fortuitous that that question came up because it certainly is a violation of international law in many different respects. And as it turns out, our clients who live in Crown Point and Church Rock, the areas that are slated for proposed uranium mine, even though the existing mine waste has never been remediated in any sort of meaningful way, and most often not at all. They have filed with us a petition in front of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, alleging various violations of the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man, which is a regional human rights treaty and one of the few human rights treaties that the United States is a party to. So it's been signed and ratified by Congress. We're bound as a nation by its provisions. So hopefully the Inter-American Commission will give us a good decision. We've made it through sort of the initial phase, which is the admissibility phase. It's only the second time in U.S. history that that a low-income community of color has challenged environmental racism in an international forum. And it's the first time that the United States' nuclear and uranium mining policy have been challenged in a international forum. The unfortunate fact of the matter is, though, the United States doesn't take its international human rights obligations very seriously. Much less seriously, I will say, than it does its trade obligations, like under NAFTA, WTO. I get a little peeved, and by a little I mean outraged, when I hear our Secretary of State and our President leveling human rights accusations against Russia and its conduct of the Ukraine invasion, when it turns a blind eye to gross human rights violations on its own soil. So, yeah, that's definitely an issue that communities are pursuing, and one I think communities are going to pursue quite a bit more in the future.
All right, well, I think we should probably call it. Again, this was so informative and depressing, but inspirational at the same time. So we really appreciate you joining, and let's do this again soon. Thank you.